Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people who claim to know you? Have your words ever been taken, rewritten, repackaged, and applauded while you stood silently in the background, watching someone else wear your voice like a trophy? This story isn't just fiction. It's for the girl who grew up speaking in whispers so others could stay loud. For the artist whose work was celebrated only when stripped of their name. And for anyone who's ever asked, will the truth ever speak in my voice again? The candle flame flickered against the draft seeping through the attic wall, bending shadows across the page as my pen dragged another line into the stitched diary. My fingers ached from the cold, but the ache was familiar, almost companionable. My words always came easier when my hands trembled. They gave me clothes her arms outgrew, a room that smelled of someone new. The ink bled slightly at the curve of the W, and I paused to adjust the angle of the paper. There was a knot in the wood beneath my writing desk where rain had soaked through seasons ago. Still swollen, slightly warped, always cold to the touch. I could hear them below, laughter rising from the long dining table where the chandeliers burned like golden crowns. Minjung's voice rose above the others, soft and smiling, trained like a harp for public charm. She was telling a story again. Something about a university gala, I thought. The others laughed before the punchline even came. I dipped my pen again. A chair to sit but not belong. A place to stay, but not for long. The attic was silent except for the occasional creak from old beams settling into their age. There was one window, smudged with time, overlooking the manicured garden where Minjung used to chase butterflies as a child. I remembered watching her from this very spot, always from behind glass, like I was pressed against a museum display of someone else's life. They called me sweet, but not by name. I didn't cry anymore. Not out loud. I'd been warned against that early on. Tears made things complicated. Unruly, Senator Hua once said, when I was 12 and had broken into tears during a dinner after Minjung's speech debut. They all thought I was overwhelmed with pride. No one asked. No one imagined I was mourning something else. My diary was the only thing that called me by my name. Jae-in Hua. Even if the surname was a courtesy, a decision made for optics, in public I was their cousin, a distant one. My mother's passing was explained with tasteful vagueness, wrapped in floral condolences and social silence. In private, I was the campaign shadow. I'll need her kept out of view during the primaries, I once overheard Senator Hua say to his chief of staff. We can't afford to complicate the narrative. She's not front-facing material. I made my birthday cake in chalk. Behind the gate, along the walk, I still remember the 7th of October. I drew a cake along the garden stone path, 3 layers, 10 candles. I hummed my favorite song and blew them out one by one. Minjung got her birthday broadcast on national television 2 weeks later. A scholarship announcement. Balloons, applause. I watched the light fall on her face and wondered if I had a place. A knock pulled me out of the moment. I flinched, snapping the diary closed like it were contraband. My tutor, Mrs. Shin, stepped inside. She always knocked before entering. Even here, where the rules rarely applied to me. You left your lunch untouched again, she said, her voice soft but not warm. I didn't answer. She glanced at the candle, then at the scattered sketches lining the far wall. Portraits, poetic stanzas in the margins, a charcoal smear that once tried to be Minjung's profile and failed. She picked up the diary without asking. I'd like to borrow this for a day or two, she said, eyes not meeting mine. Some of your metaphors, they're quite mature. I should have said no, or at least asked why. But the diary was already in her bag before my lips could part. That night, I lay on the mattress under my grandmother's old quilt, listening to the sounds below fade into silence. Somewhere downstairs, Minjung was rehearsing a new speech. I could hear her cadence, clear and strong, carrying like theater. And I thought, what would it sound like if she used my words instead of hers? 3 days later, I found out The competition was held in a marble auditorium lined with velvet chairs and sharp lighting. I sat in the back row, barely inside the camera sweep. The judges sat in a line of authority: retired ministers, news anchors, a university chancellor. The air was too polished to breathe in fully. Then she walked on stage. Minjung, wrapped in navy silk, hair pinned like a crown, expression composed with surgical grace. Her gaze swept the crowd as if it owed her its attention, and they gave it willingly. I didn't know which poem she would use. And then she began. They gave me clothes her arms outgrew. A room that smelled of someone new. The words were mine. Every pause, every breath, every fragile line I had written alone in the attic. My hands were clenched so tightly on my lap that I felt the threadwork in my coat sleeves press into my palms. I wanted to be proud. I tried. But the applause sounded like a mistake. Like thunder meant for someone else's storm. When Minjung bowed, she glanced toward the judges, then toward our father. Not once did her eyes search the shadows at the back of the room. Afterward, as cameras flashed and reporters crowded, I stood near the velvet curtain, half hidden. She really is a genius, someone whispered. A national voice, another said, so young, so insightful. I waited. I waited to hear my name, even once. Then I heard it, soft, clipped, familiar. We'll keep the authorship internal, Senator Hua said, as he turned from the green room door. It's a family matter, no need to confuse the message. Mrs. Shin nodded silently beside him. I didn't go home in the car. I walked instead, tracing the long iron fence of the estate under a cloudy sky, my diary pressed tightly to my chest. It still smelled of candle wax and old ink. They took my voice and gave it wings. And now I couldn't recognize its flight. It was raining again when they summoned me. Not the soft kind of rain that wraps around window panes like music, but the sharp, deliberate kind. Each drop a decision. It drummed against the glass as I stood outside Senator Hua's study, staring at the gold-plated door handle as if it might unlock something other than another silence. Mrs. Shin opened it before I could knock. Her expression was unreadable. Behind her, the study stretched wide and dark, walls lined with first edition books and campaign plaques, the scent of leather and aged paper hanging thick in the air. Senator Hua didn't rise from his chair. His hands were steepled beneath his chin, flanked by two aides with tablets open and waiting. Minjung stood near the fireplace, her arms folded across a navy blazer, eyes glittering with something I couldn't name. Satisfaction, maybe, or calculation. Sit, he said. I obeyed. The chair was lower than his desk, designed to keep your chin tilted up. He didn't speak right away. One of the aides clicked to the next slide, where a transcript of the poem I'd written was displayed beside Minjong's name. A second screen showed headlines: Senator's Daughter Inspires a Nation, The Poetic Future of Policy, Minjong Hua, Youth's New Voice. We're impressed, the senator said finally. You have a gift. My throat tightened. I couldn't decide if it was the first time I'd heard him say anything resembling praise. You can use that gift for this family. Quietly, productively. I glanced toward Minjung, but her eyes were elsewhere, watching a flame twist inside the fireplace, like she was above the conversation. Senator Hua continued, We're offering you an opportunity, a fellowship, study abroad, whatever path you want behind the curtain. That's where real influence lives, Jae-in. A folder slid across the desk toward me, a printed contract, thick with clauses, and beside it, an NDA, initials already marked where my name would go. I read the first line. In the interest of internal family strategy, the undersigned agrees to contribute intellectual property anonymously for... I stopped reading. You want me to write Minjung's speeches. The senator didn't flinch. I want you to be useful. Your voice is strong, but it needs a stage. She's that stage. She's not the voice. The words didn't leave my mouth, but they pressed like heat against my ribs. I stared at the folder. Fellowship, study abroad, a path out. And all it cost was my name. My hand hovered over the pen. I saw the flicker in Minjung's gaze then. A split-second glance, precise as a scalpel. She wasn't worried, not really. She had already decided what I would choose. I signed. My new room was 2 floors lower, still tucked away from the guest wings, but closer to the speech team. The walls were bare, the light buzzed faintly overhead, a desk, a lamp, a cabinet of reference books. The window faced an alley of trees, their branches whispering against the pane each time wind passed through like breath through gritted teeth. Late at night, I wrote, coffee sharp in my nostrils, ink staining the creases of my fingers, my melodies filling the silence between paragraphs. I wrote lines that made my chest ache. I tore them up. I rewrote them again. I imagined them being spoken into microphones, carved into editorials, passed from hand to hand. And then I watched Minjung say them on stages, on screens, on buses, on the side of buildings. She smiled perfectly. She tilted her head with practiced grace. She paused between syllables like she knew their weight. And maybe she did, in her own way. The audience never questioned her. Why would they? She had the face, the name, the bloodline. I was the breath inside the mask. At the Seoul Youth Policy Gala, I stood in the press wing, clipboard in hand, earpiece in place. Minjung stood beneath the chandelier, shaking hands with the Minister of Culture. She wore ivory that night, a color that glowed under the stage lights, and her lipstick was the exact hue of cherry blossom ink. I couldn't do it without my team, she said to a group of reporters. Her smile didn't falter. We're all working together, it's a collective vision. They nodded, flashed their cameras. No one asked who wrote the speech that made the ambassador's eyes well up. I slipped into the hallway, breath sharp in my throat. In my jacket pocket, my diary dug into my side like a quiet accusation. You asked for this. You said yes. Later that night, I added a new page. They made me visible only when invisible. They called me voice, but not person. They said I had power if I stayed behind the crown. They asked for my ink, not my name. They drank my silence like inheritance. Then came the National Youth Rally, a venue big enough to fit 20,000. I wrote a speech that clawed from the marrow, about identity, about unseen labor, about what it means to be heard before you are believed. It took me 5 nights and a bottle of ink. My fingers trembled when I handed it in. 3 days before the event, I read the official version in the press packet. My opening lines were intact. My metaphor for fractured futures remained, but entire paragraphs had been replaced, statistics twisted, quotes reshaped to align with party metrics. Economic forecasts I hadn't cited appeared with fake footnotes. I brought it up to Minjun during the dress rehearsal. She stood in the green room, watching herself in the mirror, adjusting the angle of her earrings. There's some data in here that wasn't in my draft, I said. She glanced at me in the mirror. The committee revised the economic section. It's normal. It's not accurate. She turned then, lips curved slightly. Not a smile, not a threat. Just control, disguised as charm. It's politics, Jane. You'll get used to it. I nodded slowly, then left the room. The speech would be broadcast live in 47 hours. I walked back to my room under a sky filled with too many stars, like they were watching me, waiting for the moment I stopped writing for others. The crowd looked endless, like a sea that had forgotten where the shore was. From the wings of the glass amphitheater, I watched thousands of students sway under a sky strung with screens and spotlights. Their faces were painted with slogans. Neon armbands pulsed in the dark like constellations. A roar echoed back from every word Min Jeong spoke, layered with conviction, artfully timed breath, and my syllables, gutted and reshaped. She stood in white, under a column of light, her expression composed yet passionate, her hand rising slightly on the second verse of the second paragraph, my paragraph, the one that once bled with protest, now repackaged into a call for policy reform drenched in numbers I hadn't written. We are not inheriting a broken system, she declared, her voice steady and bright. We are inheriting the tools to fix it. The crowd responded like an orchestra given its cue. Chants erupted. Banners waved. My body remained still. I pressed the clipboard tighter against my chest, as if it could shield me from the sound of my words returning warped, as if they no longer belonged to me. In my version, that line read, "We're handed broken compasses and told to map progress across scars." They replaced it with an equation about GDP recovery and employment forecasts. Fake ones. Edited it in without context, framed as hopeful. My heart felt like it was rising and sinking at once, the weight of something invisible pressing against my ribs. I wanted her to falter. I wanted her to turn to the crowd and say, "This isn't mine." She never did. The riot began 12 hours later. The clip had gone viral by then, not just the speech, but the numbers. Students reposted it, analysts dissected it, then the economic reports came in, and they didn't match, not even close. By evening, the Ministry of Finance issued a soft denial. The figures cited at the rally do not align with current government data. By nightfall, hashtags exploded across social feeds. False hope, policy lies, who wrote the speech? The next morning, students filled Gwangdaemun Plaza, chanting beneath skyscrapers that reflected blue skies like indifferent glass. They wore black masks, held hand-painted signs. Some carried torn pages of the speech, printed from online PDFs, scribbled over with truth. I watched it all from the corner of a tea house, my reflection pale in the window, my phone screen burning with every notification. Inside, my face was still anonymous. Outside, the world had caught fire from a spark they thought Minjung lit. I didn't see it coming. The first betrayal didn't arrive with a scream, but with silence. Mrs. Shin didn't show for our regular edit session. My speech terminal wouldn't log in, my ID had been deactivated, then came the knock. Not the gentle kind, but the mechanical rap of decision. A staffer entered the room with a tight smile. "There's been a situation," he said. "You've been mentioned in an internal review." I frowned. "Mentioned how?" His smile widened like a blade. "As the one who tampered with the speech." The words didn't settle at first. They hovered, surreal and fragile, until they sank like teeth. "I did. Management believes it's best if you take a temporary leave for the investigation." "I didn't change the data," I said again, slower this time, unsure whether I was trying to convince him or myself. "I gave them the original. They changed it. I told Min Jong." His eyes flicked down to his clipboard. He didn't meet mine. "I'm instructed to collect your badge." By noon, the leaks began. Sources close to the Hua campaign reveal a disgruntled staffer, an estranged cousin with a troubled history, may have sabotaged Minjung's youth rally address. I stared at the screen, my name in bold under the words saboteur. They'd used a school photo, an old one, where I still wore glasses and my hair hung in uneven strands. The caption read, "Dae Hua, unknown cousin, failed intern, hidden hand behind the rally scandal." My stomach twisted. They'd outed me to the press, then washed their hands. The Hua family issued a statement by evening. "She was never officially part of our team. While we grieve the breach of public trust, we must clarify that Ms. Jane Hua held no authorized role." Authorized. They had used my name, my voice, my work, and then folded me like a misprinted flyer. I returned to the estate only to find the gate code changed. A guard, new, expressionless, stepped in front of me before I could press the bell. "You're not allowed on the property, miss." I blinked at him. "My things are inside." "I was told to inform you that your room has been cleared. The contents are available for pickup by courier." He didn't look at me while he spoke, as if I were a smear on glass someone else had to clean. My bank app showed zeros across every account. The stipend I was promised, frozen. The tuition fund I never touched, gone. The study abroad application, I was halfway through, withdrawn, without my knowledge. I packed a single bag. The rest had been reduced to boxes I might never see again. My diary, increased, stained, still warm from where my hand held it too tightly, was the only thing I clutched as I stepped out of the gate. Outside, a camera shutter clicked. I turned away from the lens, pulling my hood forward. A woman from Channel N shouted my name. "Jae-in, do you deny forging the data?" Were you trying to damage Minjung's career? The question hit like sleet. They think I wanted this. I kept walking. Through traffic, through side streets, through a city that suddenly felt too loud and too quiet at once. Faces blurred, lights flashed, the air buzzed with accusations. I didn't cry. I didn't write that night either. 2 days later, a news anchor leaned into the camera, voice polished and solemn. Who was Jae-in Hwa? A slideshow played behind her. The attic photo. The leaked pages of my diary. A still frame of me at the rally, blurred in the crowd. She vanished without statement. No charges filed, no contact traced. Some say she fled the country. Others say she was silenced. The screen faded to black. In a train station locker, beneath a false name and a wool coat, I watched my story collapse into someone else's narrative. They erased me once before. This time, I'll decide what comes back. It had been 3 years since they folded my name into silence. I now lived in a one-room apartment tucked above an old bike shop, where the walls peeled in quiet corners and the heater worked only when it wanted to. The window didn't close all the way, so I stuffed a rolled-up scarf into the frame whenever the wind slipped through. Some mornings, I could see my breath while pouring tea. I didn't mind anymore. I worked odd jobs, restocking shelves, transcribing interviews, cleaning studios after hours. I did what paid in cash and asked no questions. I lived off instant broth, bruised fruit, and rice. My cracked laptop hummed like a tired heartbeat every time it booted up. My diary, aged, creased, and still carrying the scent of candle smoke from the attic, slept beneath my pillow. I never spoke my real name aloud. Not even to myself. One night, while cleaning out old bookmarks, I found a link I'd saved years ago, an obscure writers' forum titled Ink Anonymous. I remembered discovering it in the wake of my fallout, back when I was hunting for any space where names weren't currency. Back then, I hadn't dared post. I didn't think my voice deserved a return. That night, though, something cracked. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe the way my diary entries had started feeling too small to hold the weight inside me. Or maybe I had grown tired of hiding behind the silence they'd gifted me. I opened a new post. No name. No photo. Only a single signature typed in lowercase, like breath held between teeth. Solhwa. I stared at it for minutes, watching the cursor blink beneath it like a heartbeat, asking, "Are you sure?" Then I began to write. I once wore a voice like borrowed silk, praised when I stayed still, punished when I stretched. They loved me more when I had no face, and called me brilliant when they thought I wasn't real. Want to be more than background light for someone else's shine. I pressed submit and exhaled like I hadn't in years. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the glowing screen as comments began appearing, slowly then quickly. Readers were quoting the final 2 lines. One user copied it into their signature, another said they read it aloud to their younger sister, someone else posted a photo of graffiti in Busan, my lines painted across a train tunnel wall in fire orange spray. By the next morning, the poem had spread across threads, reposted by university students and art collectives. An indie musician messaged the forum admin for permission to use the lines in a track. No one knew who Solhwa was, and for the first time that anonymity felt like power instead of punishment. Solhwa became a whisper stitched between protests. Her poems echoed across rooftops. If your silence feeds their comfort, scream in ink instead. My ghost walked politely. Now it claws. The lines were printed on tote bags, on vinyl banners, recited at school walkouts, and scribbled across mirrors in cafes. Some readers thought Solhwa was a pen name for a collective of women. Others thought she was a journalist hiding from prosecution. A few claimed she was a Hua family insider, leaking metaphors disguised as rebellion. They were all half right. Every night I sat cross-legged in front of my flickering screen, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, fingers curled over keys like they might shatter if I stopped typing. My melodies no longer hummed in sadness. They marched. They burned. They hissed in my throat as I typed, vibrating like strings pulled too tight. And still, no name. Only Sohwa. My diary began to change too. Less sorrow, more strategy. Fewer lines about feeling forgotten, more about how to be remembered correctly. I didn't want pity. I didn't want redemption in their terms. I wanted to own the words they'd buried me with and turn them into weapons. I hadn't spoken to anyone from the Hua family since the day the gates closed. Not Minjung, not the senator, not the aides who paraded my ideas under spotlights and smiled for the cameras. I no longer followed their headlines. I didn't care to know what awards Minjung collected or which think tank invited her to speak. The world had made her a golden stage. I was building a revolution in the rafters above it. 3 years to the week since the rally, a message arrived in my inbox. The username was verified, the subject line was concise. From Han Sojin's office, Ray, Solhwa collaboration. I stared at the message longer than I meant to. My tea went cold beside me, the steam had barely lifted before fading. Han Sojin, activist, filmmaker, once blacklisted for exposing corruption in city redevelopment zones, now praised for turning his documentaries into policy change, a name too loud for coincidence. He'd been 17 during the scandal, a first-year economics major holding a protest sign that quoted my line. I opened the message. Your writing speaks in a way no speech ever could. We're planning a new campaign, story-driven, real voices. We'd be honored if Solho would lend hers. There was a link to a private brief, a potential publication, a meeting invitation. My hand hovered over the trackpad. My reflection blinked back from the dark screen. A little older, face sharper, hair shorter, not invisible, not quite whole. I traced the edge of the screen with one finger. Did I risk stepping forward again? What if they recognized my rhythm? What if they didn't? I reached for my diary. The page I opened to was the first poem I ever wrote, in the attic. It had yellowed at the corners, the ink had bled slightly. I ran my fingers along the verse. I wasn't bad, I wasn't mean. I just grew up where love stayed clean. I closed the book slowly. They erased JN. But Sola writes in fire. The reply came, encrypted. An attachment sealed behind a shifting cipher, signed only with the initials HS. It arrived at 2:13 a.m., just as the wind pushed a branch against my window like a knuckle rapping wood, as if something outside already knew this message, would pull me back into the world I once fled. I read the first line 3 times. Your poems speak like verdicts. They don't ask for attention, they summon it. My campaign doesn't need a slogan, it needs a conscience. You. A second file followed, an interview reel spliced with Sojin's voice over protest footage. Calm, undeniable. Where Minjung polished her words to shimmer, Sojin stripped his bare. His face wasn't everywhere, but his message was spreading. He hadn't inherited power, he'd outlived its consequences. I pressed play again. Something about his gaze stayed with me. Direct, but never predatory. He was the kind of speaker who didn't tilt his head when he listened. He simply waited. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. All right, on one condition. You don't ask for my name. You let the words stand alone. Sohwa. The agreement was silent and swift. Within a day, I was added to a secure channel labeled Mirror Doctrine, Draft 0, with a single blinking cursor waiting for my first cut. I started with an indictment. Inherited authority is the only thing that survives failure unpunished. Legacy is not merit, it's camouflage. They burn down opportunity and hang portraits of the smoke. The words poured from me like ink from an artery. I didn't try to sound beautiful. I wrote in shards, in slices. I wasn't giving the public something to admire, I was giving them something to wield. And the public noticed. Sojin's next rally, this time in Busan, drew 15,000 in the first hour. His speech included one of my lines, unaltered, and when the crowd roared it back at him in unison, I had to stop the live stream. My hands were shaking. They were quoting me like law. This is what they said Minjung was. but she never bled into the page the way I did. I closed my laptop and walked to the window. The reflection that met me in the glass was older than I remembered. Not tired, calloused. There's a difference. A week later, it began again. Not with my name, but with something close enough to start a fire. A thread appeared on a journalist forum, poem that launched Min Jung's career traced back to uncredited draft. The post included a scan faded ink, water-stained corners, faint impressions of charcoal smudges along the margin. I recognized it instantly. It was page 31 from my attic diary. The diary I thought had been cleared out with the rest of my belongings. I knew that page by heart. It was the first one I wrote in candlelight, the one Mrs. Shin had taken without permission, the one I thought I'd never see again. They close her arms outgrew. Below the scan, the caption read, "Authenticated through handwriting forensics, traced to a former Hua family resident, source protected." The post had 1 million views within 2 hours. By the end of the day, Ghostwriter Gate was trending across 4 platforms. News anchors debated the Solhwa theory, the idea that a whistleblower poet had been shaping policy under an alias all along. One article asked, was Solhwa erased before she ever spoke? Another went further. What if she's still speaking, and we're only now learning to hear her? The weight of it pressed against my ribs like breath held too long. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt exposed. I paced for hours, switching between message boards and old emails until my eyes burned. In the silence, I opened the second drawer of my desk, the one that still held my original diary, now wrapped in a cloth for protection. I untied the ribbon and traced the pressed seams. My handwriting hadn't changed much, but the voice had. I told Sojin the truth that night. Not my name, not my past, but the reality of what I was doing. "This isn't rebellion," I wrote. "It's reclamation. I don't want my name back. I want the record corrected." He replied within minutes. "Then we make that record unerasable. But we do it clean. I'll shield you, you speak." It was the first time I'd believed someone might actually mean that. I spent the next week preparing my answer. I drafted a documentary outline. A single camera interview, one-time appearance, heavily redacted audio, location hidden. Not a confession, but a statement. I spoke with Sujin's legal counsel, young, sharp, unafraid. She reviewed every clause like it was scripture. We arranged protective coverage through a third-party production house. Still, something remained unfinished. The journals, the attic ones. The rest of my pages were never returned. Somewhere inside the Hua estate they remained, maybe boxed, maybe burned, maybe sold as campaign trophies. I needed them. Not for sentiment, for proof. Every line I wrote in those journals had been time-stamped before Min Jung ever took the stage. They weren't metaphors anymore. They were evidence. So I did something I swore I never would. I searched the estate's updated security plans. The staff wing had been redesigned into a conservatory, the attic stairs sealed but not removed. 1 camera at the side gate, blind spot near the tool shed, 8-minute window at shift change. I memorized the schematic until it lived under my eyelids. I packed a canvas satchel with my remaining diary, a flash drive of my speech drafts, and a voice recorder. When I zipped it shut, my fingers paused on the zipper. I pressed the fabric flat and whispered to it. Not for luck, not for reassurance, but as a ritual. You're not returning as a secret. I was stepping into the house as Solhwa. The gate clicked open with a metallic groan that echoed louder than I expected, as if even the steel remembered the sound of letting me in once and failing to keep me out. I stepped through. The Hua estate rose before me like a monument carved out of silence, grand, immaculate, and colder than it had ever been in memory. The marble stairs still gleamed like polished bone. The ivy along the garden wall had been trimmed to symmetry. Even the windows, tall and sharp like watchful eyes, gleamed without a smudge, without flaw. Everything was perfect. Except me. Inside, the air was scented with polish and preserved wealth. That same wax and cedar mixture I used to inhale from the attic vent. It was supposed to feel like luxury. It still felt like being swallowed. A staff member guided me through the main corridor. I wore neutral clothes, gray slacks, dark blazer, glasses that weren't prescription, and behind me, one of Seojin's legal advisors walked in silence, holding the court order like a weapon she wouldn't need to unsheath unless provoked. We passed the dining hall. I remembered sitting at the far end of that long table, the silverware always polished, the conversations never addressed to me. Once, I dropped a spoon and apologized before it even hit the floor. Now, I walked past it without blinking. "Interview space is ready," the staffer said, holding open a door. I didn't enter. "I want access to the old study wing, per clause 4 of the document, personal belongings retrieval." He hesitated, then nodded. The door at the end of the West Hall hadn't been opened in years, but it still carried weight in the hinges. The scent hit me first. Dust, old paper, something floral and faint beneath it. The wallpaper had faded. One corner had peeled slightly. The desk remained in place. And there, on the shelf behind it, stacked like quiet survivors, were my journals. Navy leather, green cloth bound, a few plain black spiral notebooks. I stepped closer and my fingers hovered above the top one, heart pushing against my ribs like it was trying to warn me. When I touched it, the room bent around the memory. Late nights, my back curved over that same desk, candles flickering, the sound of laughter drifting from rooms I wasn't allowed to enter, my melodies barely audible beneath the static of Minjung's public rehearsals. I had written everything here, every speech, every stolen line, every poem. This desk held the ashes of the voice they thought they'd buried. I pulled the journals into my arms one by one, their edges soft from turning, some pages still marked with sticky notes, some had traces of tears, old salt on ink. Others smelled faintly of my old shampoo, like a time capsule I didn't know I needed to exhume. I didn't hear the footsteps until they were too close. A shadow moved across the carpet. I turned. Minjung stood in the doorway, her hand still on the frame as if she hadn't fully committed to entering. Her blouse was cream silk, sleeves pushed up, her hair tied back in an undone knot that exposed the line of her jaw. She looked different. Less assembled, less framed. She said nothing for a beat too long. Then finally, "I didn't know they kept them." Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't polished. It was something else, something I didn't expect. She stepped inside slowly, eyes fixed not on me, but on the journals in my hands. "I thought they burned them," she added. "I asked once. Father said there was nothing left to return." I didn't respond. The silence hung between us, thick, pulsing, old. She walked closer, arms loosely crossed, like she wasn't sure whether to defend or surrender. "You were always better at this." "I was good at performing it, but you breathed it." "Then why did you take it?" My voice came out low, sharp. Her gaze met mine. "I didn't want to replace you," she said, the words slow, like she was tasting their truth for the first time. "I wanted to become you." That stung more than I expected. I studied her face, the way her brows pulled inward slightly, the way her lower lip trembled once before she bit it. She wasn't acting, not this time. I wanted to hate her. She had taken everything. She wore my work like a second skin, stood beneath lights built to blind me, and when the ground cracked, she walked away clean. But standing here, in the same room I once hid in just to write without fear, she didn't look victorious. She looked haunted. "I used to find your pages in the trash," she continued, "crumpled behind the bookshelf. I read them in secret. Then I tried to write like that. I couldn't. I was always too careful. You weren't. I held the journals tighter. You could have told the truth." She looked down. I was afraid they'd stop listening. The silence returned, not hostile, heavy, tangled. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her if she ever lay awake, hearing applause meant for someone else and wondering if her voice had become a weapon she couldn't stop holding. Instead, I stepped back, sliding the journals into my satchel one by one. Her eyes didn't follow the movement. They stayed on my face. I don't expect forgiveness, she said, but I needed to say it before the rest of the world does. I froze, my fingers still on the last zipper. She stepped back toward the door. I hope you tell the truth, all of it, even if it breaks me. And she left. I stood alone in the study, the journals in my arms, the light catching on the glass frame where a family photo still hung crooked, Minjung centered, the senator stern, my place empty. I stared at it until my throat closed. Then I whispered aloud, not to her, not to the room, but to the space I once thought had devoured me whole. You can bury a name, but not the ink it leaves behind. The hallway was quiet when I stepped back out, but not empty. Min-jung stood halfway down the corridor, hands folded tightly in front of her, shoulders squared in a stance that almost passed for poise, if you ignored the way her thumbs kept rubbing against each other like they were trying to erase a memory. She didn't speak at first. Neither did I. The silence between us stretched thin, taut like wire, dangerous enough to slice if either of us breathed too hard. I memorized it, she said finally, her voice low. The poem, the one about the birthday chalk. I found it behind the heater when I was 14. You'd written it on grid paper. I blinked, the air suddenly weighted. Her gaze dropped to the floor. Father was speaking at our grandfather's funeral the next week. He wanted something personal, something poetic. I panicked. I gave it to him, said I wrote it. He used the last 2 lines in his closing. People cried. He said it was the only time he ever felt truly proud of me. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I didn't mean to start like that, she said, her voice cracking. But once I saw how people looked at me, how they listened, I thought, if I could keep sounding like you, maybe they'd keep loving me that way. Her confession wasn't graceful. It stumbled out of her like a child tripping over stairs she was taught to climb without help. Every word stripped away another layer of polish. Gone was the girl who smiled perfectly for cameras. In her place was a woman who looked like she hadn't breathed freely in years. I envied you, she continued. Not your place in this house, but the way you wrote like no one was watching. I couldn't do that. I always wrote for approval. A long pause. I took what you wrote because I thought you'd never speak. And I hated how badly I wanted to be someone who could write like that. She looked at me now. Really looked. Her eyes were swollen at the edges, raw and glassy, not from tears shed tonight, but from years of holding them back. I didn't speak, because I didn't know which of the voices in my chest to answer with. The girl who mourned alone at the back gate with a chalk cake? The shadow who sat at the edge of applause, waiting for someone to call her name. The writer who bled into notebooks in attic silence, while another wore her voice like armor. They all whispered at once, they all pulled at the same ache. Thought about our childhood. Minjiang sneaking extra dumplings into my plate when no one looked. Covering for me when I overslept a tutoring session. Sharing her umbrella in the rain, even if she never said why. Small kindnesses, forgotten by her, etched into me. I remembered watching her during dinners. How she laughed before the jokes landed, how she glanced at her father between sentences as if searching for approval in his face. Even back then, I saw it. She wasn't just performing for the world, she was performing to survive. The difference was, when I disappeared, no one noticed. When she stopped performing, the house would collapse. I exhaled slowly, the weight of memory anchoring me, and I moved past her. My steps were quiet, deliberate. The satchel on my shoulder grew heavier with each stride, as though the pages inside had absorbed the gravity of our shared silence. She turned after me. Aren't you going to say something? I stopped, let the tension coil back between us like thread, waiting to snap. Then, without turning, I said, "This isn't about you anymore." The words fell like stone in a still lake. No echo, just impact. And I walked out. Back in my apartment, the air felt different. Smaller, realer, mine. I set the satchel on the floor and unzipped it slowly, laying each journal across my desk like sacred offerings. The lamplight caught the pages, some smudged, others annotated with the fierce handwriting of a girl trying to outrun erasure. I flipped one open and found a draft of the first speech I ever wrote for the campaign. One line was circled twice. Truth does not need applause. It only needs a pulse. I read until my eyes stung, until the pages blurred and the air around me softened into music. Then I opened a fresh notebook and began to write. The anthem wasn't for Minjung. If it wasn't for the public, it was for every girl who learned to speak only after being silenced, who crafted sentences in closets, who made art from invisibility and survived long enough to be heard. I wrote it slowly, each word shaped with precision, pain, and power. I didn't flinch this time. I didn't pause to second guess. The melody hummed from my throat, low and rising, like breath returning to something once declared dead. Hours passed. The sun began to rise through my window, casting long shadows across the floor, turning the silver ink of the final line into something almost glowing. I held the pen over the last word, paused, then wrote it. I leaned back, staring at the page. The anthem was finished. I closed the notebook gently, the weight of it grounding me. Then I reached for my phone and opened a draft email. To Han So-jin. Subject: Final version attached. Message: I'll speak. At the funeral, you are right, some ghosts do want their names back. Let the world guess who I am. I'm ready for them to hear me, even if they still don't know my name. The crowd outside the Hall of Honor was an ocean of dark coats and silent calculation. Cameras clicked like insects in the wind, shutter flashes cutting through the gray daylight like bursts of static. The marble steps were polished to a reflective sheen, and every inch of space was occupied by souls most powerful. Ministers, media figures, corporate heirs standing shoulder to shoulder, draped in black silk, and inherited silence. I arrived with a single escort and a court order. The moment my foot touched the lowest step, the cameras turned, first with confusion, then recognition. A hush spread across the crowd like frost, words caught between breath and disbelief. Some didn't know who I was. Others remembered everything. The official at the gate looked at the folder in my hand, eyes darting to the press behind me. The seal on the top page glinted with legal authority. He stepped aside. Inside, the air was colder than the marble beneath it. The funeral chamber was vast, columns stretching upward into shadow, the senator's portrait towering above a sea of black floral arrangements. The image they'd chosen was from his re-election night. Confident, resolute, untouched by scandal. The version of him they still wished to preserve. Minjung sat in the front row. Her hands were folded in her lap, her eyes fixed ahead, but the moment I entered, her shoulders stiffened. She didn't turn, but I felt her gaze edge toward me, like a tether pulled taut. I walked to the podium in silence. No official introduced me, no name was read aloud. I carried my diary pressed flat against my chest, the pages marked and folded, the new anthem tucked inside like a blade concealed in cloth. I looked up at the lights, then I looked out at the room. The murmurs rippled like a wave against steel. Politicians exchanged glances. Some tilted their heads, confused. Others narrowed their eyes, recognizing not my face, but my presence, the weight of unspoken authorship finally stepping into view. I opened the book, and I read. They taught us to speak through mirrors, but never to survive our own reflections. They dressed us in borrowed light and called it brilliance when it shone just right. My voice did not tremble. They said our silence was dignity. They called our disappearance obedience. But we were never quiet. We were erased. A pause. Not for effect, for breath, for truth. This was never about revenge. This was about correction and the right to speak your name and be believed. I closed the book gently. Then I looked down at the front row at Minjung, whose eyes shimmered with everything she could not say in this moment. Her hands trembled slightly where they rested against her lap. I looked up once more, and I left the stage. The silence lingered. For a breath, two. Or then someone stood, a single person, then applause. Quiet at first, then rising. Not thunderous, not theatrical. It was the kind of applause that meant something had cracked and now could not be uncracked. Outside, reporters surged forward. I didn't answer questions. I handed over a sealed envelope, the authenticated scans of my journals, speech drafts, annotations, and correspondence, my signature at the bottom. I watched as the headlines rolled out in real time. Sol Hua, identified as Jian Hua, original author of the iconic Anthem. Hua, family silent as authorship scandal reopens investigation. From Attic to Anthem, the girl who reclaimed her voice. Minjong issued a statement 2 days later. It was short, direct. The words the world loved were not mine, they were hers. I carried them with shame, and now I return them with truth. The lawsuit regained momentum. Former aides came forward, archived voice memos resurfaced, some in my handwriting, others matching my tone. Analysts traced speech patterns, linguists verified metaphors. The narrative cracked, and the silence that once held it in place finally shattered. I did not attend the next rally. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat at my desk, the same one that wobbled slightly if I leaned too far to the left. My diary lay open, a clean page, a fresh pen. The window was cracked, wind brushing against my cheek like a long-awaited apology. I hummed softly as I wrote. A new piece. It wasn't an anthem, not this time. It was quieter. For me, for the girl who sat in attic silence, of the one who whispered her birthday wishes in chalk, or the one who was never asked her name until she wrote it in fire. The melody swirled through the room, low and even. Outside, a protest line carried my poem on their banners. Inside, I wasn't watching the news. I was writing. I do not need to be remembered for shouting. I only need to be heard without disappearing. I signed it without hesitation. Jane Hua. Not Sol Hua, not the cousin, not the echo. Dan. And it was enough. In a world that teaches us to shrink, sometimes survival is quiet, but reclamation? Reclamation is loud, unapologetic, and deeply personal. Jane didn't rise to destroy. She rose to correct, to remind us that authorship matters, not just of stories, but of identity. Because the power to name yourself is the first power they try to take away. But here's the question we leave you with. Have you ever let someone else take credit for your truth out of fear, love, or survival? And more importantly, what would it take for you to speak again? Tell us your answer in the comments. And if this story moved something in you, like, subscribe, and stay with us. Because some stories don't ask for attention. They demand to be heard.